back for episode 9 of STEAM Engine Academy presents 28 Days of Color. Today's topic, color in politics. We'll talk about the Voting Rights Act for our history lesson, and then we'll interview with a politician from California, Fatima Alleyne. Stay tuned. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in U.S. history. Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency in November 1963 upon the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In the presidential race of 1964, Johnson was officially elected in a landslide victory and used this mandate to push for legislation he claimed would improve the American way of life, such as stronger voting rights laws. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited states from denying a male citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Nevertheless, in the ensuing decades, various discriminatory practices were used to prevent African Americans, particularly those in the South, from exercising their right to vote. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, voting rights activists in the South were subjected to various forms of mistreatment and violence. One event that outraged many Americans occurred on March 15, 1965, when peaceful participants in a Selma to Montgomery march for voting rights were met by Alabama state troopers who attacked them with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips after they refused to turn back. Some protesters were severely beaten and bloodied. Others ran for their lives. The incident was captured on national television. In the wake of the shocking incident, Johnson called for comprehensive voting rights legislation. In a speech to a joint session of Congress on March 15, 1965, the president outlined the devious ways in which election officials denied African American citizens the vote. Black people attempting to vote often were told by election officials that they had gotten the date, time, or polling place wrong, that they possessed insufficient literacy skills, or that they had filled out an application incorrectly. Black people, whose population suffered a high rate of illiteracy due to centuries of oppression and poverty, often would be forced to take literacy tests, which they sometimes failed. Johnson also told Congress that voting officials, primarily in southern states, had been known to force black voters to recite the entire Constitution or explain the most complex provisions of state laws, a task most white voters would have been hard-pressed to accomplish. In some cases, even black people with college degrees were turned away from the polls. The Voting Rights Bill was passed in the U.S. Senate by a 77-19 vote on May 26, 1965. After debating the bill for more than a month, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the bill by a vote of 333 to 85 on July 9th. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law August 6, 1965, with Dr. King and other civil rights leaders present at the ceremony. Act banned the use of literacy tests, provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes and state-local elections. In 1964, the 24th Amendment made poll taxes illegal in federal elections. Poll taxes in state elections were banned in 1966 by the U.S. Supreme Court. Although the Voting Rights Act passed, state and local enforcement of the law was weak, and it often was ignored outright, mainly in the South and in areas where the proportion of black people in the population was high and their vote threatened the political status quo. Still, the Voting Rights Act gave African American voters the legal means to challenge voting restrictions and vastly improved voter turnout. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among black people increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. Since its passage, the Voting Rights Act has been amended to include such features as the protection of voting rights for non-English speaking American citizens. Welcome back to 28 Days of Color, presented by STEAM Engine Academy. Today's episode is Color in Politics. I'm here with Dr. Fatima Alleyne to discuss politics and the role they played in her life. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm really excited to have access to even speak to you. So this is very special for me. So my first question to you is, how did you first get into politics and what inspired you to do so?
So my experiences actually as a parent in West Contra Costa Unified School District is what inspired me to become involved in politics. I wanted to be one of the change agents for our children, for our parents, for our families and teachers. And so that's what really inspired me to leverage my voice at the dais to bring real life experiences to the table.
And I saw that you have 4 children, and I have a set of twins of my own. And so, knowing that you're a parent really made me feel like you would understand as a parent what I go through. So, I appreciate that you said that. Now, what office did you hold, and where were you?
So I held the office of the Contra Costa County Board of Education. So I was a trustee on the board. I served in that capacity for 4 years. And it was a privilege to serve. And now I'm moving on to something different.
Oh, very nice. Well, after the election, I want to ask you, how did your opponent handle that transition of power? And I know we've seen it in the US and how it was handled by the country. How was it handled for you?
So the individual who succeeded me, she and I didn't have a relationship previously. She was a trustee in West Contra Costa. So at my last meeting, I decided to wish her the best of luck. And that's something that I did not even receive from the person I succeeded. And so I don't believe in being fake or superficial with anybody. And so if I didn't speak to you before, I'm not going to speak to you now. But I did make sure that I wish them the best of luck, particularly during this time, because it's very challenging at the moment.
Right, and I appreciate that a lot. We're setting the tone for the new year. We're setting the tone for expectations and how we should behave as politicians, as Americans. I appreciate that representation from our community standpoint. And, through 2020, the political climate has done a complete 360. Everything has really been turned upside down. And, between being a parent and managing politics, what are some of those challenges that have kind of come together?
So I'll just tell you, I have a breadth of, my children have, they are quite diverse. So I don't have one, 2 children that are alike. And so, learning how to navigate public education as a parent created its own obstacles and challenges. And being able to adapt and maneuver in that space. And so I brought that to light. And so when there were questions or there were discussions that made me feel uncomfortable, particularly, when we were talking about parents and children of color, particularly Black and Latino students, I wanted to make sure that we were not, our bias did not influence how we describe situations. And so I always questioned and asked for clarity from that parent lens. And I also brought the perspective of parents to the table, and I solicited input from parents because that's important, because you're our clients. This is, I think that we've lost that service element to leadership. And it's not the loudest voices, it's all the voices. And so that was what was important for me. And that's what I continue to bring to the table whenever it came to decision making.
Right. And that's so necessary. And it's unfortunate that you're not able to still contribute in that way to the Board of Education. Now, with that, what is something that you were passionate about when you were in office and that you still are now?
So the great thing is that as an engineer, so I am fortunate to serve in the capacity, and I always say service because I am of service to the community at UC Berkeley. And so diversity, equity, and so I'll say diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging, allyship, accessibility are all key values of mine. And so in my work on the county board, I brought those values there. We started the Equity Initiative. I supported the Equity Initiative, supported, us moving beyond resolutions to actual action. So, and holding ourselves accountable to what we claim are our values. So I've been able to do that work, continue my work at UC Berkeley as well, and even as a consultant. So it's just, I'm leveraging my skills, and I have diverse clients to leverage my skills.
Wow, I really am so appreciative that you're still in there in that capacity at UC Berkeley. And, we need to kind of mirror your efforts. What can we do in the Black community to advocate for ourselves, to kind of give our contributions the same way you have, even outside of office?
So one thing is, let's not vote people in because they look like us, right? So that's the first thing. Stop giving ourselves passes, right? The reason, I will be honest, one of the reasons why I did not, I was unsuccessful in winning the re-election was because there were people that looked like me that supported my opponent, although they didn't really make moves or strides to really impact our students in public education. And so I am always committed. I'm not going to compromise my values. So I think we all need to stay true to our values. Being in office doesn't mean that I compromise who I am or the people I say that I'm serve. If I'm there to serve kids and families, then I'm gonna serve kids and families. And I think that we as Black people need to stop, and I just say parents as well in general, we need to stop giving passes to our teachers, right? Our teachers are there to serve our students. They're there to serve our families. And we have some really great teachers that are there, but there are some that need some additional resources and support to better execute their job. And there needs to be some accountability.
Right. And, with that give and take, the parents need support, the teachers need support, and they're looking to the Board of Education for support. What is some of the support you or didn't receive when you were in the Board of Education? What was that climate like, being a person of color in the Board of Education?
So I was the only one there at one point. So at one point, I did have a colleague who was the other African American male on a board. And the teachers union were successful in removing both of us from the board. So there are no Black faces there in 4 years. So we went from having two to zero in 4 years. And so, it was isolating. And we did make strides, right? Because it's not just about the color of your skin, it's about having common values. And so for me, the only other person at one time was I administrative assistant, right? And so that's when I really campaigned and I really advocated for more diversity, because our board, the cabinet of the superintendent, excuse me, should reflect the diversity of the community that we serve. Right. And so we had that conversation, and I continued to ensure that we had that conversation when we talked about our hiring practices. I said, there's no reason that we don't have Black leadership. It's no reason why we don't have Latino leadership. I should not attend a board meeting and the only people that are well represented are white people. And so we continue to have that dialogue, right? And so we've seen, as a result of my advocacy, and the support of the superintendent and my colleagues, some of my colleagues on the board, we've seen that shift where we do have people of color that are in our leadership or on cabinet. So I can say that we've started to do it. Let's see how it is sustained.
Well, what are you doing now that you're out of office? What are you continuing to do in the community now?
So one thing, I am starting a new scholarship program for those that are for our system impacted youth. And so I lost my brother back in May of 2020 during the height of COVID. He was 27 years old, and it was really because of his lack of access to high quality healthcare. And he leaves behind a 2-year-old, she's 3 now, and a 5-year-old. And so I want to make sure that that those individuals who are system impacted, and he wasn't necessarily system impacted, but he also wasn't well served. And one thing that I wanted to make sure was that the system impacted youth knew that there were opportunities that they can go to college, they can pursue higher education, they can pursue a trade. I was someone who was in a gang. I was someone who got arrested, and I became the first Black president of the Contra Costa County Board of Education. And so I want to continue to support people that made some bad choices. We all make some choices that we regret. And so that's one thing that I'm doing. The work that I do at Berkeley is also, providing opportunities to those who are underrepresented in STEM, and creating a space in engineering for people with diverse backgrounds, with diverse expertise, and not only bringing them in, creating space for them, right? Just and what their cultural values and all of that, so that they don't have to code switch every single time they attend a meeting, or they're in a room, that you are meeting people where they are, and they are meeting you where you are. So we want to be forgiving of others that assault us, and they call them microaggressions. I'll say aggressive behaviors towards us, and it needs to be reciprocated. So I'm elevating that conversation, and I also am a consultant, so I provide resources to school districts across the state who are willing to have some courageous conversations, in addition to helping my 3 school-age children navigate remote learning.
That by itself is that's a whole nother episode. That right there is a whole nother episode. It has been so good to talk to you. I feel like we need to have more discussions with you. I'd like to know more. I've definitely learned a lot in the time that we've spent talking today. That has just blown my mind as a parent, as a teacher, as someone in business who wants to make sure that everyone is kind of taken care of and accounted for. I hope that we speak again. I do. I appreciate.
You know how to reach me, and we can have that candid conversation over an Arnold Palmer, because I love Arnold Palmers. I'm more than happy to do that with you, and we can invite people to just listen, hang out with us, talking candidly about STEM, public education, about access. I'd love to have that conversation. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate getting to reach out to you and you responding. It meant a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Finishing off another episode with a story, today we're going to read The Talking Eggs, a folktale from the American South, retold by Robert D. Sansucci and illustrated by Jerry Pinkney. Find out what happens when we're kind and the consequences when we're not.
The Talking Eggs. Back in the old days, there was a widow with 2 daughters named Rose and Blanche. They lived on a farm so poor, it looked like the tail end of bad luck. They raised a few chickens, some beans, and a little cotton to get by. Rose, the older sister, was cross and mean and didn't know beans from birds' eggs. Blanche was sweet and kind and sharp as 40 crickets. But their mother liked Rose the best because they were alike as 2 peas in a pod, bad-tempered, sharp-tongued, and always putting on airs. The mother made Blanche do all the work around the place. She had to iron the clothes each morning using an old iron filled with hot coals, chop cotton in the afternoon, and string the beans for supper. While she'd be doing these chores, her mama and sister would sit side by side in rocking chairs on the shady porch, fanning themselves and talking foolishness about getting rich and moving to the city, where they could go to fancy balls wearing trail train dresses and lots of jewels. One hot day, the mother sent Blanche to the well to fetch a bucket of water. When the girl got there, she found an old woman wrapped in a raggedy black shawl, near fainting from the heat. "Please, child, give me a sip of water.
the old woman said. "I'm about to die of thirst." "Yes, Auntie," said Blanche, rinsing out her bucket and dipping up some cool, clean well water. "Drink what you need." "Thank you, child," said the old woman when she'd taken a swallow after swallow of water. "You got a spirit of do-right in your soul. God is going to bless you." Then she walked away down the path that led to the deep woods. When Blanche got back to the cabin, her mother and sister hollered at her for taking so long. "This water's so warm it's near boiling," shouted Rose, and she dumped the bucket out on the porch. "Here your poor sister's near dying for a drop of cool water," her mother screamed, "and you can't even bring her that little thing." Then the two of them scolded and hit Blanche until the frightened girl ran away into the woods. She began to cry since she didn't have anywhere to go, and she was scared to go home. Suddenly, around the bend in the path came the old woman in the raggedy black shawl. When she saw Blanche, she asked kindly, "What's made you cry so, you poor child?" "Mama and Sister Rose lit into me for something that wasn't my fault," said Blanche, rubbing tears off her cheek. "Now I'm afraid to go home." "Hush, child, stop your crying. You come on home with me. I'll give you supper and a clean bed. But you got to promise you won't laugh at anything you see." Blanche gave her word of honor that she wouldn't laugh. Then the old woman took her by the hand and led her deep into the backwoods. As they walked along the narrow path, bramble bushes and tree branches opened wide in front of them and closed up behind them. Soon they came to the old woman's tumble-down shack. A cow with 2 heads and horns like corkscrews peered over a fence at Blanche and brayed like a mule. She reckoned it was a pretty strange sight, but she didn't say anything, not wanting to hurt the old woman's feelings. Next, she saw that the yard in front of the cabin was filled with chickens of every color. Some were hopping about on one leg, some running about on 3 or 4, or even more. These chickens didn't cluck. They whistled like mockingbirds. But strange as all this was, Blanche stuck by her promise not to laugh. When they got inside the cabin, the old woman said, "Light the fire, child, and cook us some supper." So Blanche fetched the kindling from the woodpile outside the back door. The old woman sat down near the fireplace and took off her head. She set it on her knees like a pumpkin. First she combed out her gray hair, then plaited it into 2 long braids. Blanche got pretty scared at this, but the woman had been nothing but kind to her, so she just went on lighting the fire. After a bit, the old woman put her head back on her shoulders and looked at herself in a silver of mirror nailed to the cabin wall. She said, nodding. "That's better." Then she gave Blanche an old beef bone and said, "Put this in the pot for supper." Now Blanche was near starving, and the bone looked pretty sad as a meal for the 2 of them, but she did what the old woman said. "Shall I boil it for soup, Auntie?" she asked. "Look at the pot, child," the old woman said, laughing. The pot was filled with thick stew bubbling away. Next, the woman gave Blanche only 1 grain of rice and told her to grind it in the stone mortar. Feeling mighty foolish, Blanche began to pound the grain with the heavy stone pestle. In a moment, the mortar was overflowing with rice. When they had finished their supper, the old woman said, "It's a fine moonshiny night, child. Come with me." They sat themselves down on the back porch steps. After a time, dozens of rabbits came out of the underbush and formed a circle in the yard. The men rabbits all had frock-tail coats, and the lady rabbits had little trail-train dresses. They danced, standing on their hind feet, hopping about. One big rabbit played a banjo, and the old woman hummed along with it. Blanche kept time by clapping along. The rabbits did a square dance, a Virginia reel, and even a cakewalk. The girl felt so happy she never wanted to leave. She sat and clapped until she fell asleep, and the old woman carried her inside and put her to bed. When Blanche got up the next morning, the old woman told her, "Go milk my cow." The girl did what she was told, and the two-headed cow with the curly horns gave her a bucket of the sweetest milk she'd ever tasted. They had it with their morning coffee. "You gotta go home now, child," the old woman said to Blanche, who was washing the breakfast dishes. "But I tell you, things will be better from here on out. And since you are such a good girl, I got a present for you. Go out to the chicken house. Any eggs that say 'take me,' you go ahead and take. But if you hear any say 'don't take me,' you leave them be. When you get near home, throw those eggs, one after another, over your left shoulder so they break in the road behind you. Then you'll get a surprise." When Blanche got to the little chicken house, she found all the nests filled with eggs. Half were gold or silver or covered with jewels. Half looked no different from the eggs she got from her chickens back home. All the plain eggs told her, "Take me." All the fancy ones cried, "Don't take me." She wished she could take just one gold or silver or jeweled egg, but she did what the old woman told her and only scooped up the plain ones. She and the old woman waved goodbye to each other. Then Blanche went on her way. Part way home, she began to toss the eggs one at a time over her left shoulder. All sorts of wonderful things spilled out of those eggs. Now diamonds and rubies, now gold and silver coins, now pretty silk dresses and dainty satin shoes. There was even a handsome carriage that grew in a wink from the size of a matchbox, and a fine brown and white pony that sprouted from the size of a cricket to draw it. Blanche loaded all of these lovely things into the carriage and rode the rest of the way home like a grand lady. When she got back to the cabin, her mother and sister just gawked at her new finery. "Where did you get all of these new things?" her mother asked, making Rose help Blanche carry the treasures inside. That evening, the mother cooked dinner for the first time since Blanche was old enough to hold a skillet. All the time telling Blanche what a sweet daughter she was, and her mama got the girl to tell about the old woman and the cabin in the woods and the talking eggs. When Blanche was asleep, the mother grabbed Rose and told her, "You gotta go into those woods tomorrow morning and find that old auntie. Then you'll get some of those talking eggs for yourself so you can have fine dresses and jewels like your sister. When you get back, I'll chase Blanche off and keep her things for myself. Then we'll go to the city and be fine ladies like we was meant to be." "Can't we just run her off tonight so's I don't have to go poking through those woods looking for some crazy old auntie?" Rose whined. "There's not near enough for two," her mother said, getting angry. "You do as I say, and don't be so contrary." So the next morning, Rose set out drag-foot into the woods. She dawdled mostly, but soon met the old woman in her raggedy black shawl. "My sweet little sister Blanche told me you got real pretty house and all," said Rose. "I appreciate to see it." "You can come with me if you've a mind to," said the old woman, "but you gotta promise not to laugh at whatever you see." "I swear," said Rose. So the old woman led her through the bramble bushes and tree branches into the deep woods. But when they got near the cabin and Rose saw the two-headed cow that brayed like a mule and the funny-looking chickens that sang like mockingbirds, she yelled, "If there was ever a sight, that's one! That's the stupidest thing in the world!" Then she laughed and laughed until she nearly fell down. Said the old woman, shaking her head. Inside, Rose complained when she was asked to start the fire, and she wound up with more smoke than flame. When the old woman gave her an old bone to put in the pot for supper, Rose said crossly, "That's gonna make a mighty poor meal." She dropped it in the pot, but the old bone remained a bone, so they only had thin soup for supper. When the old woman gave her 1 grain of rice to grind in the mortar, Rose said, "That sad speck won't hardly feed a fly." She wouldn't lift the pestle, so they had no rice at all. The old woman muttered. Rose went to bed hungry. All night long she heard mice scratching under the floor and screech owls clawing at the window. In the morning the old woman told her to milk the cow. Rose did, but she made fun of the 2-headed creature, and all she got was a little sour milk, not fit for drinking. So they had their breakfast coffee without cream. When the old woman lifted her head off her shoulders to brush her hair, quick as a wink, Rose grabbed the head and said, "I'm not gonna put you back together till you give me them presents like my sister got." "Ah, child, you're a wicked girl," said the old woman's head, "but I got to have my body back, so I'll tell you what to do. Go to the chicken house and take those eggs that say 'take me,' but leave the ones that cry 'don't take me.' Then you toss those eggs over your right shoulder when you're on your way home." To be sure the old woman wasn't playing her a trick. Rose set the old woman's head out on the porch while her body sat groping around the cabin. Then she ran to the chicken house. Inside, all the plain eggs cried, "Take me!" while the gold and silver jeweled ones said, "Don't take me." "You think I'm fool enough to listen to you and pass up the prettiest ones? Not on your life." So she grabbed all of the gold and silver jeweled eggs that kept yelling, "Don't take me, don't take me," and off she ran into the woods with them. As soon as she was out of sight of the old woman's cabin, she tossed the eggs over her right shoulder as fast as she could. But out of the shells came clouds of whip snakes, toads, frogs, yellow jackets, and a big old gray wolf. These began to chase after her like pigs after a pumpkin. Hollering bloody murder, Rose ran all the way to her mother's cabin. When the woman saw the swarm of things chasing her daughter, she tried to rescue her with a broom. But the wasps and wolf and all the other creatures wouldn't be chased off. So mother and daughter hightailed it into the woods with all the animals following. When they returned home, angry and sore and stung and covered with mud, they found Blanche had gone to the city to live like a grand lady, though she remained as kind and generous as always. For the rest of their lives, Rose and her mother tried to find the strange old woman's cabin and the talking eggs, but they could never find that place again. The end.
One more again. Mas não. Mas não. Mas não. Caviar. Espesso. Caviar. Espesso. Caviar. Espesso. Mas não vou sem te chamar, caviar. Espesso. Caviar. Espesso.